Well, hi everyone. I am recording this video in case I am absent from school tomorrow because one of my kids is sick at home today. And so I have a feeling I'm going to be absent tomorrow. And so if you're listening to this, I am in fact absent. And this guided lecture is meant to replace the notes that we would be doing in person normally. So you can see here by the title, we're covering World War I, which at the time was known as the Great War, or unironically, the war to end all wars. And we're going to talk about it in two different ways. I'm going to give you two different perspectives, I suppose. The first thing we're going to focus on are the causes of the war, and these causes are mostly not related to American history too much. But I think it's important context. It's stuff that you should have gotten back in world history, but I don't want to assume. And so we're going to do that. And then we'll transition to looking at how the war shapes American history and what role America plays in the war and its aftermath. America plays a very minimal role in the start of the war, in the beginning of the war. But once America becomes involved in the war, America is pretty heavily involved in the war and the negotiations after the war. And that's kind of the important stuff as far as the APUSH curriculum is concerned. So I mentioned that you should have studied World War I a couple of years ago in world history, but it tends to come at the end of the course. And so it's hard to say, for me as a teacher, how much of this you really got. And so I think a refresher is beneficial for all of us. When we think about the causes of World War I, they're varied and they are long term. Most of the causes are long term. We think about the short term cause of World War I, that's like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the political and diplomatic crisis that followed in the summer of 1914. But the reason that diplomatic crisis can lead to a continent-wide, war and eventually a global war is because of the long-term situation, primarily in Europe, but elsewhere. And I think the acronym MAIN, which you've probably heard before, is a good shorthand to consider the long-term causes of war and to remember them. Militarism and the buildup of military forces, the alliance system, which really began in the late 19th century and codified in the early 20th century, imperialism, and nationalism. These are the big four. There are other causes as well, but I think for our purposes, this will at least give us a working understanding of how World War I came to be such a large and all-encompassing affair. Militarism is really a result of, Europe has always been a militaristic society, but militarism, especially modern industrial militaries, are in many ways a result of the unification of Germany, which is happening in the 1870s, and the fear that a lot of other European states have that a unified Germany will be able to upset the balance of power in Europe. And so we have an arms race in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that has led to the formation of standing armies, very powerful navies, and also military alliances. And so militarism and the alliance system go hand in hand. You really don't have one without the other. Germany is located in the middle of Europe, in Central Europe, and Germany has two very powerful states on either side of it, France to its west and Russia to its east. And all three of these countries are going to be fearful in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, while also being quite proud, quite patriotic to varying degrees. And so that's going to create a pretty tense situation. The alliance system, you can see here in this infographic, the first alliance system to come together are the Central Powers, which at the time are referred to as the Triple Alliance. You can see that by 1882, these three countries, Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Germany, have banded together. They are all located in Central Europe, and they are lesser powers when you compare their geographic area, their population, and their militaries. They are lesser powers to some of their neighbors, specifically Great Britain, but also France and Russia. And so because of that, these countries, two of which are quite new, Italy and Germany, only come into existence in the 1860s and 1870s, respectively. They feel that the best way to ensure their survival is through an alliance, a mutual alliance, a military alliance. In response to this, we start to see some alliances between Russia, France, and Britain. And you can see these have really come together by the early 1900s. But notice that these are not military alliances, especially between Britain and Russia, France and Britain. Britain is an island, or rather a series of islands. I guess the United Kingdom is a series of islands. I'll use the term as correctly as I know how. And Britain doesn't really feel the need to enter into military alliances because it has the protection of water. It is surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean and the English Channel. And so it'll enter into treaties which are not as binding as alliances, but eventually this will help to drag Britain into the war. There are some other minor states that we don't need to be too concerned about here: Bulgaria, Serbia, the Ottoman Empire. For thinking about the short-term causes of World War I, certainly Serbia is very important, but for our purposes in U.S. history, not that important. So here's the Triple Alliance. You can see here when you look at the map of Europe, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, right in the center of Europe, and they are surrounded by France, Russia, Britain, some pretty powerful possible foes, certainly historical foes, so possible foes in the future. And then Britain, France, Russia. You can see the Triple Entente. Now, it gets a little confusing because the Triple Alliance, which is formed in 1882 during the war, is going to become known as the Central Powers. And the Triple Entente during the war is going to become known as the Allies. So the Triple Alliance are not the Allies. So that's just a note about the wording that we'll be using. The I in main is imperialism. We know the story here, so I won't belabor the point. Europe has been engaging in a spasm of colonial activity in the second half of the 19th century, really 1870s to 1890s. Europe has sought to conquer much of the unconquered world, and you can see that on the map here. This has led to competition. It has led to a host of possible flashpoints for a potential conflict. You know, when you have all these European colonial states down here bordering each other, that could lead to a conflict. And a colonial conflict could spread to a general European conflict. And so imperialism is doing a couple things. First, it is bringing these European powers closer together in terms of like geographic borders. Second, it is encouraging European powers to build up their militaries. And we've already talked about how the unification of Germany and to a lesser extent Italy has also encouraged European powers to build up their militaries in preparedness for a potential war. So imperialism is doing that as well. And it's just creating this general atmosphere of competition, economic competition, military competition, political competition. The European states see themselves in a fight for, if not survival, some of them see survival, then expansionism and power. And so that's imperialism. Last is nationalism. And nationalism is one of the most important forces to understand when we're looking at 19th and early 20th century European politics. Nationalism is unleashed by the French Revolution in 1789, and it has not gone away. It has continued to spread, continued to intensify, and it has also helped to fuel the fire of competition in Europe. When you add nationalism, this idea that a nation should be filled with people of that nationality and that those people should be proud of their nation, you get some pretty strong feelings which could be utilized to specific ends if you have a conflict. And so nationalism is going to cause some European states to want to conquer others, simply put, to see themselves as better than others and to help them justify, that's kind of a key word with nationalism, justify a war. And so there you go, there's Maine. So World War I for APUSH is really not important. The United States is not going to get involved in this war until 1917, at least directly. And you can see when you look at this map, much of the fighting, certainly the major battles, are before that. Most of the major battles are 1914 through 1916. If you know anything about the fighting of World War I, you probably know about trenches, and you probably know about the stalemate. And that is much of the war from the American perspective. This seems like a kind of silly war. It seems like a useless war. And so, from the American perspective, we try our best to stay out as long as possible. But eventually, the country does get dragged into the conflict. There are two fronts. Again, when you think about the war, you probably think about the Western Front. And the Western Front is pretty solidified by the end of 1914. There is very little land that is going to be exchanged between 1914 and really the spring of 1918. The Eastern Front is a little bit more mobile, and you saw that when you looked at the map here. If you take a look at the front and how the front is changing in the war in the East more than it is in the West. The front in the West really doesn't change until, like I said, we get until 1918. There are some changes there, but they are eventually beaten back by the French. The war in the East changes more. The lines change more. This helps us to understand what is happening here. Mostly is like a lot of this is after the October Revolution in Russia in 1917. So Russia experiences this massive revolution, two revolutions in in February and October of 1917, and that's going to really weaken Russia internally, and it's going to lead to some big offensives. Again, for APUSH, it really doesn't matter. What does matter is why America is staying out of this conflict, what America is doing to stay out of this conflict, and how America eventually gets drawn into the conflict. When war breaks out in 1914, it's important for us to remember the makeup of the United States. The United States in 1914 is a multicultural empire. We already talked about in Unit 1 how the United States has become an imperial empire and has annexed places far afield from the United States. So that aspect is certainly multicultural, but also we're an immigrant nation. And so when you look at the demographics of the United States in 1914, the percentage of immigrants is going up. And where are these immigrants coming from? A number of them are coming from Europe, specifically the belligerent states. There are Germans, there are Italians, of course, there are British and Irish. So we have people in the country who have divided loyalties. They may see themselves as American, or they may see themselves as Irish. They may see themselves as some hybrid. And so that's going to create a situation politically in the United States where it's not really clear which side we support culturally, I should say. That being said, what we start to see is that our historical ties are to Great Britain. We do have a number of immigrants who are coming from Eastern and Southern and Central Europe, but culturally, historically, much of the country feels like it owes its allegiance to Great Britain and the British Isles. And so as the war accelerates into 1915, 16, and 17, the United States makes a pretty clear choice. And that choice is to support the Allies, Great Britain, France primarily. And we can see that through charts like this that show the economic impact of World War I. In 1914, we're pretty much selling things to all of the belligerent countries in Europe, but very quickly by 1915, it completely drops off in regards to Germany, and it's going to increase in regards to the other Allied powers, the other side of the war. Now, that's because of a couple reasons. One of the reasons is because the United States does have stronger economic ties with Great Britain to start. And we see that here. Even before the war, we are exporting more to Great Britain than any other country in Europe. Another reason is because the British begin to blockade Germany at the start of the war. And so the United States would have had to cross that blockade, which could have threatened the US's neutrality. And so the United States takes an easier path, which is to just stop trading with Germany and replace that trade to Great Britain. You can see that here. The drop off with Germany is basically $400 million. The increase to Great Britain is almost $400 million. Certainly coupled with the increase in France and the other European countries, we've made up the loss to not trading with Germany. Woodrow Wilson is very careful. Woodrow Wilson is the president at the time, and he is very careful to make clear that the United States is going to remain neutral in the war. But Wilson is also making it clear that he believes the United States has a vested interest in making sure that the world is, his words, safe for democracy. And so, even through 1916, the election of 1916, Wilson is an ardent, I almost said imperialist, he kind of is that too, but an ardent supporter of neutrality. But he's going to start to prepare the nation for a potential war. He's going to start to talk about how the nation needs to be the leader of the free world. And so the United States might have a role to play in the war. But that takes a long time to get the United States there. There's also this aspect of imperialism, too. There are some people in the country when World War I breaks out who are saying this is the United States' opportunity to carve off some of this empire from other European countries. And so there are some people in the country who are saying, maybe we do want to get involved in this war because it could benefit our empire. Remember, America has really entered into that phase of its existence where we are going to be an imperial nation. One of the things that brings America closest to the war in its early stages is Germany's use of submarines, what they call the U-boats, Unterseeboats. The Germans at the start of the war are sinking ships which are aiding the Allied war effort. And this includes American ships, certainly British ships, but also ships that are bringing materiel, weapons specifically, to the Allies. And the most famous example of this is the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. The Lusitania is a British passenger liner that is sunk by a German U-boat. And a number of Americans are killed in the sinking. It is a passenger liner, so you would think that it is off limits during a time of war, but it is also carrying munitions, which are coming from the United States to Great Britain. So it's a little nuanced. It's a little more complex. Nevertheless, the United States remains neutral through all of this, and I try to stress that to my students. Sometimes students view the sinking of the Lusitania as a watershed moment. It is in some ways. It convinces many Americans that Germany are, air quotes, the bad guy in this. But America, it does not cause America to enter the war. In fact, it'll take another 2 years for the United States to enter the war. So the Lusitania is significant. It helps to turn public opinion against the Germans and in favor of the British, but it does not cause the United States to get involved in the war. And in fact, after the sinking of the Lusitania, Germany stops unrestricted submarine warfare because Germany is worried that if they continue down this path of unrestricted submarine warfare, they could draw the United States into the conflict, and that would be very bad for them. So I mentioned in 1916 that Woodrow Wilson, despite his rhetoric about keeping the world safe for democracy and the 14 points, which we'll talk about in a moment, he runs on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." So this shows the extent to which Americans really want neutrality. Woodrow Wilson is running for re-election, and he views neutrality as a winning platform, and it is. He wins re-election in 1916. But as we have seen before, Wilson is making sure that the country is prepared for war. But we do not see the draft until America has actually declared war. America declares war in April of 1917. So we'll talk about that in a moment. There is a draft during World War I. There are drafts during most conflicts in U.S. history. It's quite rare after it's not quite rare. It hasn't happened since World War II. But for most other major wars prior to that, there is a draft. In World War I, that's the Selective Service Act, passed in May of 1917. Men between the ages of 18 to 45 are eligible for the draft, and there are multiple draft drives that we see throughout the war. We also see the expansion of the Navy. Now, this goes back to Alfred Thayer Mahan and the 1890s and the age of imperialism, the arguments there. 1917 is our fulcrum year. This is our year when the United States gets into the conflict finally. There are two factors which lead the United States in the short term to get into the conflict. The first is that Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, they do this because by 1917, the German war effort has become somewhat desperate. The British have been blockading Germany for 3 years, and the war is really taking a toll on German society. And so the Germans, because they are getting desperate, they say we need to cut off the supplies to the Allies, and much of that stuff is coming from the United States. So Germany knows it's a risky proposition to start sinking U.S. merchant ships, but they feel they have to do it because their other alternative is a slow death in the war. And so they resume unrestricted submarine warfare, which really upsets the United States. And also, in the winter of 1917, or I guess is it the spring? Early 1917, a diplomatic communication that was meant to be secret between Germany and Mexico is intercepted by the British. And what this note, which is nicknamed the Zimmermann Note, says or proposes is that the Germans propose an alliance with Mexico. They urge Mexico to invade the United States, to take back the land that Mexico had lost in the Mexican American War about 70 years, 80 years prior. When this is intercepted by the British, it is passed on to the United States, and it incenses the United States government because here Germany is trying to secretly create a war between Mexico and the United States. And so by this point, there's like all these factors that have already gone into the United States choosing sides. Basically, the United States has been supporting Britain economically. This unrestricted submarine warfare has really angered a number of people. The Germans are cast as the bad guys by early 1917, and the Zimmermann Note is really the straw that breaks the camel's back. And so the Congress declares war in April of 1917, and the United States enters the war. The other factor, which I haven't mentioned yet, but I think is important, is that another reason the United States enters the war is by 1917, the Allies owe the United States a great deal of money. They have bought many of the things that the United States is shipping them on credit. If the Allies lose the war, the United States is concerned that they won't get that money back. And so the United States also has another strong economic reason to enter into the conflict on the side of the Allies, and that is we want to make sure they pay their debts. So lots of reasons to enter the conflict. Wilson has a plan for peace that he has been ruminating on throughout 1917, and he announces this peace plan to the world in January of 1918. And this is going to be known as the 14 points. You can guess why. There are 14 things that Wilson believes has to happen in order for a conflict like this to not happen again. And the 14 points are Wilson's roadmap for peace. And they are quite idealistic, many of these points that he has on here. And when you look at this, you can see how idealistic Wilson is being here. He seeks an end to secret treaties. He wants to ensure the freedom of the seas and free trade. These are things that would benefit the United States greatly, by the way. He wants to reduce national armies and navies around the world. The thinking is that if you don't have a strong army and navy, you will seek to find solutions to diplomatic problems without the use of the military. You won't want to fight a war, basically. Adjustment of colonial claims with fairness towards colonial people. Sounds nice. Changing borders and the creation of new nations based on self-determination. Self-determination is the idea that the people within a given land area should be able to determine their political system. Crazy idea. The most important of his 14 points is the League of Nations. And the 14 points, when we consider them in a historical way, when we consider the meaning behind them historically, 13 of these points don't go into effect. Wilson bargains them away, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The League of Nations is the one that he gives up everything else for. He believes that the League of Nations is the key to a future of peace. The war ends in November of 1918. Once the United States enters the war, it is a foregone conclusion that the United States is going to, the Allies are going to win. I mentioned that Germany is really suffering by the time we enter into 1917. By 1918, they are all but a broken society. They have lost millions of troops. They are experiencing bread riots, extreme rationing. German society is beginning to collapse. And so in 1918, they sue for peace. A, um, a halt to the hostilities is called in 1918, and a general peace conference is convened in 1919. And out of this, we get the Treaty of Versailles. We actually get a series of treaties out of the Paris Peace Conference, but the treaty between the Allies and Germany is the Treaty of Versailles, and that's the most famous of the treaties. So we usually talk about that treaty. The other treaties are lesser treaties and are of lesser significance. So in January, in the winter of 1919, the Allies convene at the Palace of Versailles, the former home of the Louis the 16th, 17th, 18th, Napoleon, all of those former great French monarchs and rulers. And at the Paris Peace Conference, there are delegates of 32 countries who are all going to be jockeying for what they want in peace, what they want to see in these peace proposals. So this is going to be a very, very messy conference. And it lasts for months. It goes from January to June of 1919. There's some big issues that have to be hammered out. Where the borders are going to be, which states are going to continue to exist, which states are going to be broken up, how much money the losers of the war are going to have to pay, and how peace is going to be maintained. These are all issues that the delegates of the Paris Peace Conference are going to seek to solve. In many ways, it was never going to work out well. The Allies have strong disagreements. They have very different perspectives. And they also, in many ways, do not understand the world in which they are living. And that's kind of unfair and a judgment made in historical hindsight. But when we look at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, it was pretty much doomed from the start. The four countries which dominate the Paris Peace Conference are Great Britain, France, the United States, and to a lesser extent, Italy. Italy is actually going to leave the conference early because they feel they are not being treated with the same amount of respect as the other big three are treating each other. These are the most powerful countries of the Allies. They are the largest countries. They are the countries that have sacrificed the most in terms of men and materiel. But they have very different aspirations and very different goals. France wants Germany destroyed. France is the country that borders Germany, as does Italy. Great Britain and the United States do not, and so they are not as interested in destroying Germany as France is. The United States, we already talked about the 14 points. Great Britain is interested in the German Navy, making sure that it can't threaten British naval supremacy. Also, Great Britain is interested in German debt and making sure that the war debt owed to the Allies is paid by Germany. Italy is interested in land, specifically along the Adriatic coast, and Italy does not get as much land as it feels it was promised or it deserves. And so that's why they're going to leave the conference early. There are some big countries here that are not represented. Russia is not represented because it does not exist anymore. I mentioned those revolutions in 1917. Russia has been replaced by the Soviet Union. And in 1919, it is embroiled in a very ugly and bloody civil war. Germany and its allies are also not represented. And you might say, well, why would they be? They lost the war. That is not the perspective of the Germans. The Germans feel that they sued for peace and that it was a mutually agreed upon decision. When you look at the German situation, it is desperate, as I mentioned, but also there has been no fighting on German soil. There have been no Allied troops on German soil. In the winter and spring of 1919, there are still no Allied troops on German soil. So while the Allies are going to look at this conflict as one that Germany lost, Germany is not going to look at it that way. And so when they are locked out of the proceedings at the Paris Peace Conference, they are incensed, quite angry. A lot of this is setting the stage for World War II. And I don't want to overstate that too much. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit on this slide. But there are definitely seeds of World War II that we see here. And this German anger and resentment over the handling of the Paris Peace Conference is one of those seeds that is planted in 1919. So the terms of the treaty are dictated. They are dictated terms. The Treaty of Versailles, in historical memory, has been viewed as a very harsh treaty. And the classic story around the Treaty of Versailles is that it was unnecessarily punitive towards Germany. There has been a good amount of revisionism in the historical community within the last 20 or so years around the Treaty of Versailles. And actually, the historical community is moving more, the pendulum is swinging the other way. It is moving more towards a view that, in fact, the Treaty of Versailles was pretty much what we would expect. And actually, when you look at Germany, if Germany had won the war, they would have created a treaty and dictated those terms to the Allies that would have been as harsh, if not harsher, than the Treaty of Versailles. So when we look at these terms, the loss of territory, severe restrictions on the size of the German military, the war guilt clause, the fact that Germany has to accept that they were the ones who caused the war, these reparations payments, the loss of their colonies, all of these things probably would have been put on the Allies by Germany had the roles been reversed. And a lot of historians, as I say, within the last 20 to 30 years, look at the Treaty of Versailles as a pretty like standard boilerplate treaty for like a losing nation. So I say this because we talk a lot in our class about how history is complex, and the Treaty of Versailles is quite complex. If you look at standard accounts of World War II, there are a lot of standard accounts that are going to say, well, World War II is caused by the Treaty of Versailles and the conditions that are placed on Germany. What I would say about that is it's only a half truth. The Treaty of Versailles angers a lot of Germans. That much is true, no doubt. But the way that the Treaty of Versailles is utilized by people like Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, the way that the Paris Peace Conference proceedings are warped, and the way that they are packaged and used as propaganda are different than the actual reality of the terms of the treaty. And so that's how I would say that. I would kind of stress that. When we look at Germany itself, Germany is going to lose a decent chunk of land here. Germany is going to lose almost a third of their pre-war territory, which is what you see in the darker brown that is being carved off of Germany. In some instances, it is being ceded to new countries like Poland, for example. In some instances, we have the creation of demilitarized zones where Germany is only nominally in control. Also, remember at the end of the war, Germany had troops all over Eastern Europe. So Germany essentially had control of all of this land. Once Russia backs out of the war, they lose all of that land as well. So it goes beyond just what this map is showing us. Germany loses a huge chunk of land in 1919. And remember, Germany had felt like it would be holding on to a lot of this because to them, this was an agreed upon truce. They were not the losers of the war. The great task of the peacemakers in Paris in 1919 is to recreate the European map. And they do this with an eye towards self-determination, trying to create a map that is less imperial, less controlled by empires, and more nationalistic and controlled by nationalities and the creation of nation states. They also do this with an eye towards trying to avoid another conflict. And so they're trying to weaken Germany. They're trying to create like national states that are not angry at imperial overlords. This is like the Serbia, Austria-Hungary situation that sparked the war. And so when we look at the European map, things get real confusing real quick. Again, for APUSH, don't need to be too concerned with this. If you take AP Euro with me next year, we'll get more into this. But for APUSH, what we see is a series of new nation states. Austria-Hungary gets carved up into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire gets carved up into Turkey, Palestine, Iraq, Transjordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Russia is getting carved up. This land, a lot of it was ceded to Germany in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. Now, the Paris Peace Conference, the Allies are going to take that and they're going to use that land to create parts of, or in whole, Romania, Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So what we see here is that Eastern and Central Europe is a mess. And in the 1920s and 1930s, there's a whole host of new states who are new to the idea of ruling themselves. That's going to create a very unstable situation. That's another seed for World War II that we will talk about. In the United States, the big thing that happens is Congress rejects the treaty. Woodrow Wilson spends a lot of time in Paris. He bargains away 13 of those 14 points to make sure that the League of Nations is created, and the League of Nations is created, but the United States never ratifies the treaty and never joins the League of Nations. And that is a central thing. That is a key point. Because what happens in 1919 is that much of the Congress says, we don't want to be a part of European affairs. World War I was a mess. Europeans are crazy. They like war, and there will be another. And we, the United States, have no interest in getting sucked into it. And that was the fear, that if the United States joined the League of Nations, we would get sucked into the war. And so there are a number of American congressmen and citizens who reject the idea of getting involved in European affairs. And so Congress rejects the Treaty of Versailles. It is never signed by the United States. So while the League of Nations is created, it is incredibly weak because the one country that had really wanted it, the United States, never joins. I already mentioned Germany views the treaty as unfair and overly harsh. Historians pushing back against that view, but what we know is that in the 1920s and 1930s, the Treaty of Versailles was used as a scapegoat. It was used as a way to vilify the Allies, the French, the British, the Americans to a lesser extent. Colonies. Many of them had showed up to Paris believing in Woodrow Wilson's vision that they might be able to garner their own independence. They are almost all locked out of the negotiations, and almost all of them remain colonies. Even places like the Ottoman Empire, where you had all of these new areas that are being created, they are not being freed. They are not being created into independent states. They are created as league mandates, colonies in all but name. And so a lot of these colonies, Africa, Middle East, to a lesser extent, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, I say lesser extent, but maybe not. I mean, places like India, Vietnam. I mean, there's a lot of foreshadowing of what's going to happen in the 20th century with the Paris Peace Conference and the people who are there. Japan and Italy also upset. They gained less than they had hoped to gain. The League of Nations is incredibly weak. And so the legacy of the treaty is that it plunges the world into another catastrophic war. Now, I don't want to overstate that, right? One of the key takeaways I want you to have from this guided lecture is that the treaty does not cause World War II. But what the treaty does, what the Paris Peace Conference does, is it creates many of the conditions that allow for people like Adolf Hitler, that allow for people like Benito Mussolini, that allow for the Japanese imperial military to take advantage of the situation. It creates a lot of unrest, it creates a lot of instability, and it creates a lot of questions. It creates more questions than it solves. And so it's no surprise, again, in hindsight, that just 20 years later, the world is once again at war. One of the best ways is the last thing I'll say, and I'll end the notes after this, but one of the best ways to really think about World War I, what World War I does is it tears down the old order that had existed in Europe and to a lesser extent elsewhere. It tears down many of these old empires, and what it does is it tears down that old order, but it fails to create a new order in its place, at least a new order that is stable and lasting. What World War II does is it creates that new order. And so I think as we get further away from World War I and World War II, as we get, let's say 100 years from now, World War I and World War II in some ways are one giant conflict with a 15-year truce in the middle. Because World War I tears down that old order, but it doesn't solve the issue of what should our world order be. So I hope that makes sense. Hope it wasn't too boring. Maybe you watched this on like 5 times speed and listened to me talk like a chipmunk. No problems with that. And I hope to see you in class soon. My kids stay healthy, please.